Hello, my name is Ben Jeanette, and I'm a training coordinator for the National Center for School Safety. I'm happy to welcome everyone to this series of videos and podcasts on school threat assessment. In the first year after the NCSS School Threat Assessment Toolkit launched, the main toolkit page has had over 18,000 views. Because of the strong interest, we've created this series of videos and podcasts to provide additional insights to help you navigate and implement behavioral threat assessment in K through 12 schools. Specifically, we will be having conversations with subject matter experts to discuss topics from who should be on your team to evaluating your program. Before we dive in, here's a little bit about us. The National Center for School Safety is a multidisciplinary, multi-institutional team that is focused on improving school safety by convening leaders in prevention, response, recovery, and other subfields of school safety. We are housed at the University of Michigan and serve as the Stop School Violence Program National Training and Technical Assistance Center. By the end of this series, you should be able to recognize key components and considerations of a threat assessment program in K through 12 schools, interpret essential elements of the School Threat Assessment Toolkit, and explain the importance of program evaluation for maintaining fidelity and protecting students' rights. In this introduction to the Illuminating Insights into the School Threat Assessment Toolkit series, I am joined by co-authors of the School Threat Assessment Toolkit, Dr. Dewey Cornell and Dr. Jennifer Maeng of the University of Virginia School of Education and Human Development, to discuss some of their research in the use of threat assessments in K through 12 schools. Thank you both for joining me today to discuss this topic. What kind of research have you done in the use of threat assessments in schools?
Well, we've been doing research on threat assessment in schools for the past 25 years. In 2001, we developed a behavioral threat assessment and management model for schools. It was called the Comprehensive School Threat Assessment Guidelines, or CSTAG. We've published about 35 studies in peer-reviewed journals, as well as a lot of technical reports and book chapters. Our research is really on how schools implement the model and what kind of outcomes they achieve.
That's great. What kinds of studies have you conducted?
Well, our first studies were really just field tests to try out the model and learn what we could do to improve it. We also developed a training program and did several studies to improve the training and make sure that it works for educators and mental health professionals and law enforcement officers. We completed 6 controlled studies, including a randomized controlled study. And we've done large-scale implementation studies to examine how threat assessment works under real-world conditions. We've done statewide studies in Virginia, then one in Florida, and currently we're doing a sample of schools from 5 states.
How often do you see schools do threat assessments?
So we know there's a lot of variation in how often schools do threat assessment. It depends on a lot of factors, such as the school size, the grade level of the students, and how often threats are reported. Threat assessment depends heavily on whether students, teachers, and other staff are willing to say something when they hear something concerning. However, we've looked at threat assessment rates in thousands of schools, and there are some average rates. In general, a school of about 1,000 students will have about 15 cases each year, which is about 1.5% of the student population. The rate is a little higher in middle schools, and it's a little lower in high schools.
That sounds like quite a substantial amount of work for each of these schools to conduct.
It can be, but most cases don't require a full threat assessment. In all cases, a multidisciplinary team collects information from multiple sources, considers context and the circumstances of a child's behavior before reaching conclusions and taking actions. In the model that we studied, about 80% of cases referred for a threat assessment are resolved as not posing a serious threat. Maybe the student's joking or frustrated and said something they didn't really intend to. And these cases don't require the same amount of work or effort as a serious threat where students need to take protective action or develop safety.
What about non-traditional schools like charter schools or even alternative schools?
So the rates for charter schools are fairly similar to regular public schools. They're also similar for specialized schools like schools for the arts or schools for science and technology. The rates, however, are higher in alternative schools for students who may have behavioral difficulties. It depends a lot on the student population at that school.
Threats of violence are very concerning. How do you know that threat assessment of students is safe?
Well, yes, all threats of violence are concerning, and every school has students who make threats or engage in some kind of threatening behavior. But when a student is angry or upset in the classroom, every teacher is going to do an automatic personal threat assessment of what's going on and whether that student is serious and what the student might do. That kind of assessment is intuitive and subjective. They don't call it threat assessment, but that's what it is. So from my point of view, the real question is not whether schools will or will not do threat assessment. It's what kind of threat assessment will they do? Will they do it systematically with a standard protocol that is fair and objective and has been scientifically tested? Or do they kind of make it up as they go along? And many schools continue to use a zero tolerance approach, which means they just remove the student from school automatically, regardless of the circumstances. So you ask whether a threat assessment is safe. So across all of our studies, schools using threat assessment have resolved thousands of threats to shoot and kill or in some way harm someone. None of these threats in any of our studies have resulted in a shooting or any form of homicide. Now, in part, this might be due to the fact that shootings and homicides are statistically rare, but there are many serious threats that raised a lot of concern in the school, and so this is a reassuring outcome. Now, we've also looked at violent outcomes that were less severe than a shooting. In our most recent studies, about 5% of the time, the student engaged in some kind of physical assault. These were basically fights, and fewer than half of 1% resulted in some kind of serious injury. In controlled studies, we were able to show that schools using this model had fewer fights than schools not using threat assessment or using a different model. We also found less bullying in schools using threat assessment. Finally, we found that teachers felt safer in schools using threat assessment. So although there's no guarantee that a school will never have a threat carried out, there's considerable evidence that threat assessment is safe and effective.
What happens to students who receive a threat assessment? We see in the news many cases where students are removed from school and sometimes arrested and charged with crimes.
So students are much more likely to be removed from school or arrested in schools that are not using a threat assessment approach. Threat assessment is a problem-solving approach. It's designed to support students and help them resolve whatever problem or conflict underlies the threat. There are many reasons a student might make a threat. They might have a conflict with a peer, or there might be bullying happening, or maybe the student has a learning problem. It really depends on the nature of the problem. And most students who receive a threat assessment are given supportive services such as counseling. The threat assessment team reaches out to parents and consults with them. And in the most serious cases, the team will develop a safety plan that likely involves a variety and several services and supports to help the child. We also want to keep students in school as much as possible. Under a zero tolerance approach, students are automatically removed from school. These are the types of cases you hear about in the news. But if a school uses threat assessment, the removal from school goes way down. Our controlled studies show students substantially reduce out of school suspension, and students are rarely expelled from schools. About 90% of students continue in their original school, and students who receive threat assessments are rarely arrested. Our studies show these positive results are for all students, regardless of racial or ethnic background, family income, or disability status. So threat assessment reduces or removes disparities that we often see in schools that aren't using threat assessment or using a zero tolerance approach.
Interesting. So how hard is it for schools to implement a threat assessment with fidelity?
Well, it's actually a lot harder if they don't use threat assessment. But school threat assessment it's not a quick and easy fix, but it does deliver solid benefits to schools if they do it well. Now, Dr. Maeng and I recruited 188 national experts on school threat assessment to find out what they felt was needed for a school to have a high quality team that would function with high fidelity. And we used their input to write the School Threat Assessment Toolkit that's available from the National Center for School Safety. So what do schools need? Well, first and foremost, they need administrative support and they need a multidisciplinary team. And that team is going to need substantial training and they need to have ongoing time and support to carry out threat assessment. The school needs support services that can be made available to students when a team identifies a need. And we know, however, that schools are often understaffed and that our administrators, our school counselors, our psychologists, our social workers, other staff, they have lots to do and many students with needs. So this needs to be accommodated as part of the threat assessment program. But these are services that schools ordinarily would have. Now, most of our studies were schools that were using threat assessment under routine conditions, and some of them were not operating with high fidelity. Nevertheless, the schools generated positive results, even with some that were not up to par. So we're optimistic that when schools are using threat assessment with high fidelity, they will get good results. Now, in our current project, we developed a measure of team fidelity of implementation. That is, it's a self-report survey of teams that covers the critical areas that they need to be effective. I can mention a couple of the areas for threat assessment teams to be effective. First, the team must be given time and authority to conduct threat assessments. And they must have good relationships with the special education staff, the mental health staff, the teachers, all of whom are going to work together when there's a threat assessment and a need to take some appropriate action. The school needs effective ways for students and others to report threats. And really this means first and foremost that they have a positive climate where students trust the staff and understand that seeking help to prevent violence is not snitching. The team also needs to work closely with parents. It needs to be a transparent process that's collaborative and not adversarial. Let me just say the team also needs time to meet because they're busy. They need a reliable record system to document their work and to share information with one another. They need a standard process for gathering information and formulating safety plans and following up to make sure the plan is working. So this is an extended process that needs to be well documented and monitored. And at the end of the year, teams need to be able to look back on what they've done over the course of the year and evaluate the fairness and the effectiveness of their program. We found that when teams score high in our fidelity measure, they also report being successful at preventing violence, helping students, and calming concerns about violence in their schools. Overall, schools with higher fidelity also have lower rates of exclusionary discipline, that is, suspending students or removing students from school. So overall, we think that schools should be routinely measuring their fidelity of implementation and evaluating their programs so that they can maintain high standards and make sure that their threat assessment process is safe, fair, and effective.
And thank you again for joining me today to talk about this research in threat assessments.
Our pleasure.
Many of the topics and key elements that Dr. Cornell and Dr. Maeng discussed are further explored through in-depth conversations with subject matter experts in this series. If you are interested in learning further about threat assessments in K-12 schools, you can access the School Threat Assessment Toolkit at nc2s.org.